Hi, everyone. Welcome again to our Brookline Literacy Coalition meeting. And we're going to get started. I'm going to hand it over to Miriam Fine. So Miriam, go ahead.
It's great. Thanks, Ben, for the introduction. And thanks, Gary, for joining us. We're really excited to talk to you about this topic. So yeah, as Ben said, just feel free, everyone, to put questions in the chat. We'll be monitoring, and I'll just get started with just a kind of three-part, very broad question for you, Gary, if that's okay. Just to frame it, what is social studies? Is it history, geography, civics? Is it an umbrella term? Does it change over the grade levels? As students go through school? Why have you claimed, I think, in your book with your co-author, that it's the hardest subject to teach and possibly the most important? And the third part of that question is kind of, what is your general assessment of the state of social studies education, just given the state of education in general, the culture, all of that? So just a very, very simple question. You don't have to go into too much detail, but just to kind of frame it so we understand what we're talking about here.
Got it. So first of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm flattered. And I'm not an expert in literacy, and I'm barely an expert in social studies. So anyway, thanks, and pipe up with questions. I'm happy to hear anything from the audience. So what is social studies? And why is it so hard? And what condition are we in? So I think it's all those things you mentioned. It's a study of history and geography and civics and economics and all those fields. It's the study of human beings, the nonfiction world, not biology, not necessarily the science of psychology, but it's a study of human society. It's a study of humans interacting, making meaning. It's a study of all the stuff we've done and all the stuff we're doing, the engagement in our everyday lives. So that means it's an awful lot. And so that's why we have a long list of disciplines that qualify as social studies. The simplest thing to say is that we start, and I think we have to do this. I think we do this. We tell stories about the human world, about stuff people have done in the past and in the present. And so I do think there's history everywhere you look in the social studies curriculum. And I think if there isn't, if you dig a little bit deeper, you'll find it, and you should bring it out. But I also think we're responsible in social studies for introducing students to the map. Where do we live and how do we represent that? How does physical location affect how we live and how we interact? Civics, how does the government work? How do we interact with that? How do we distribute power? How do we claim rights? All that stuff. I mean, that's all part of this big nonfiction human world stuff that is what we study. I think that our field, you said maybe the most important. It is by far the most important, Miriam. It's got to be the most important. Because we have to live together. If we do what we're doing right, I think that we learn lessons about how to live together well. And we get clarity about what our own individual purposes are and what our collective purposes are. If you want to be a citizen in a democratic republic, I think what we have to teach is really, really important. By the way, if you have the math chair on, he better say the same thing. He better say math is the most important thing, because if he's in charge of math, he better believe that. But I happen to believe that I'm right and he's wrong. So it's hard, but let me say specifically what's hard about our field. One of the things that's really hard about our field is it takes an enormous amount of content knowledge to do it well. You have to know a lot, and that's forbidding and challenging. And so I pick on math a lot. So Josh Parrish, the math chair, is a good friend. I love Josh, and I tease him all the time. Math, if you get a degree in math, and you then go to teach math, you know all the math you will ever teach. Now, that doesn't cover pedagogical content knowledge, knowing how students will learn the techniques and content knowledge of math, what kind of errors they'll characteristically make. There's still teacher stuff to know. But if you have a math degree, you know well through differential equations, advanced concepts, and you will never get that far in high school. In social studies, the nature of the beast is, even in high school where we hire content specialists, I mean, I just turned 60. I'm still trying desperately to learn enough to teach my ninth graders. I mean, I'm reading all the time. And not only that, when I think I've mastered a subject, somebody comes out with a book and says that everything I learned was wrong. So it's endless. And then let's add for content knowledge, we're not done. I read the newspaper. History's piling up as we speak. It's piling up. We just lived through a pandemic, a very unusual presidency. I mean, there's a lot going on, right? So all of that is fair game for what we do. So I think it's quite forbidding. And if you think about the early grades where teachers have to do everything, and they have to do stuff like teach kids how to behave in the classroom, how to read, how to, like, everything. They have to teach all subjects. Even if we're not going to do the differential equations of social studies in first grade, but you still have to know your subject. And if you didn't major in it, it's forbidding. The other thing that makes it particularly hard is that it is a lot of disciplines. It's not just history. You have to know kind of, and depending on the level, more or less, but you have to know civics draws from political science, which is a discipline. Economics is a discipline. Anthropology, sociology, geography, these are all disciplines. Psychology informs our work too. They all ask different kinds of questions. They all have different core concepts. They all have disciplinary literacy, and we're responsible for all of that. So it's really hard and it's really important. So the condition, what condition is social studies education in? I think we'll talk. I think this will give us lots to talk about tonight, but one of the, what condition is it? We don't teach enough of it, particularly in the early grades. That's the first thing I'll say. And I think, and this is where our interests are identical, I think. History continues, social studies, knowledge of the human world continues to be important for literacy, I would say forever, but especially crucial in the early grades, because it is one of the forms of content knowledge that makes text available to kids. They can understand the world, all of the concepts embedded, what's a city, what's a town, what's a mayor, what's a president, what's a king, what's a queen, like all of this, what's a market, what's a commodity, what's a good, what's stuff, like all of the concepts that animate our field, that's what opens up the world of nonfiction reading. Most of what people read in life is nonfiction. I love fiction, but most of what we have to read, whether it's work or the news or just the books that are sold. So I think we don't do enough of it, given how important it is, both to citizenship and to fundamental literacy. And then in the places where we do history at the high school, and all high schools in Massachusetts certainly have history departments and they require history or social studies education. I would say there the problems are somewhat different. And my biggest complaint, and this is in our book, our support materials are not well aligned with a framework for thinking in a way characteristic of expertise in our field. So our textbooks say silly things all the time. They announce that the cause of the Great War was alliances and militarism and a bunch of stuff. Alliances are not dangerous, but we have to read to kids, oh, one of the causes of the Great War was alliances, but with no explanation, with no evidence. So causal thinking is a mess in our textbooks. Narrative, which is the spine of our field, textbooks could do a better job of simply telling a story and telling students, how do we know this? And how do we put together a story like this? Now, teachers can do that for sure, but the textbooks could be more of an open hand and help us to understand how you construct a historical narrative. Because I think at the end of the day, we need to teach kids how to do that too. Lots of people are in the field trying to help make things accessible to us. Stanford History Education Group curates documents. The documents are often linked to questions that don't really make sense. This is true of the prominent inquiry method in our field, C3. Lots of model inquiries with questions that don't really make sense. AP College Board uses a lot of fancy vocabulary. A lot of it reduces to, please tell a good story. So the support materials in our field, in my view, have a long way to go. But to go back to the first thing, we need more of it in the early grades.
Excellent. Well, we're gonna get to the early grades and ask some questions about that. That's great. Let's start with what kind of the end in mind, or the high school first, and we're gonna kind of cycle back to the early grades, and how we need more of it, what we can do. So at the high school, level, we've heard you talk as the curriculum coordinator that, there are core documents that we want all Brookline High School students to read and understand. So let's talk a little bit. We'd love to hear you talk about foundational skills, because as the Brookline Literacy Coalition, we're also very focused on making sure that kids, can learn to get the words off the page accurately and efficiently and fluently. And social studies is a very reading heavy subject, as you were saying. It's so what about the foundational skills? There's an assumption that by the time the kids get to high school, they know how to get those words off the page, but we all know that that's not true for all kids. So what has your experience been? Do you have any sense of how prevalent it is for students to have trouble accessing the words, in books or in the texts that they need to read for history or for social studies? How prevalent it is? What do history teachers do about it? How do they manage it? What can they do about it at the high school level? And what types of text? I mean, they're reading, is it text? Is it on digital? Does it matter? Print or digital? Also websites. Do teachers use websites and videos and slideshows? And, is that helpful? To what extent are students actually kind of getting that experience with complex text at the high school, though, both, reading? So foundational skills and what that looks like at the high school is our question.
So let me put off the document initiative for a second and talk about the more general question, which is how do kids read in our classes? And I would say this is even more true after pandemic. Reading is a great discriminator. There's the students for whom what we ask them to do is not a heavy lift are the students who read well. And that has a lot to do with background knowledge. I have a student in my 9th grade class who frequently recommends books to me. That's awesome. That's amazing. He's home reading books. He's pulling books off the parents' shelf. He's buying books. He's 14 and he's reading. He's ahead on Yuval Harari. He's read the next one, and I'm one behind him. He keeps recommending the next one. I have students who struggle to read a textbook level and age-appropriate reading, and that's common. That's normal. I don't know. So I'm new to the science of reading. I've been reading a lot the last 2 years, but this is news to me. And I wonder how much of when I see kids struggling, how much of it is lack of background knowledge, small vocabulary relative to the demands of the subject, lack of stamina, reading habits. They're just reading a lot does get you in the habit of reading. It makes you better at it. And how much of it is, if you push it all the way back, they are actually not fluent and they're not good decoders. I don't know. I don't know that. I mean, there are students with language-based learning disabilities that I do know about. It's very helpful when I have an IEP and I can read it and understand. Students are all over the place in terms of their current reading abilities in my class and in the classes I observe. What do we do about it? Well, let me tell you about the 9th grade class, and then I'll tell you about my observations in the other classes. So we built a new 9th grade class, and I'm teaching in that experiment. In 2019, we launched World History, Identity, Status, and Power. It's an unleveled course. And one of the things we talked about in the planning was we don't need students to all read the same thing, but we need them all to learn through reading about the same topic. And so what we did was we invented, and the team worked really hard on this, we have mild, medium, and spicy readings for all of our sources. And so, and we don't lock kids into that. We push kids to read the hardest thing they can. But if we're reading about the construction of the Chinese Empire, in the old Chinese Empire, we'll have readings at different levels of lexical difficulty, right? They're rated differently. And students who we want to push them to read the hardest one they can, but we don't want to push them to read something they can't understand. So we offer mild, medium, and spicy sources. It's revealing, and it's also a scaffold. It's a helpful thing. It acknowledges that students have different current abilities, and it lets them access the material. We want to be able to engage them in a conversation about how the Chinese Empire worked. What would it mean to be a scholar official, and how do you get to be one, and so on. And we want them to get that information. We want them to build the independence and the strength to continue to learn from the reading more and more and more. So how well does that work? I don't know. The trajectory is, I mean, again, I think we're now reading many of the same things, the Matthew effect. Those who read well tend to read more. They read more complex texts. They learn more complex vocabulary. They get better and better and better at a rate that it depends. I mean, there are students who can read very well who will choose a very simple text because they're not interested, or they're interested in something else, or stamina, or motivation. But the reality is that the kid who keeps recommending books to me is accelerating. He's accelerating fast, and that makes the challenge in the classroom real and more real over time. So we all know that. We all know that reading is a great challenge. It's a great differentiator and discriminator in the classroom. In the piece that you shared, the history as literacy piece, Jon mentions at the end of the blog post, and it's an argument about why background knowledge is so important, why history is so important to background knowledge. If you want to understand text, you have to understand vocabulary. It's just another way of saying you need to know a lot of stuff in order to read in that field. And so much of it is transferable to words that are generally useful for high-level conversation. You get more of that if you read more. We seriously think sometimes about, would it be better if we just had kids read the whole block? And I see that my friend Eric is on the call today. You know, there's a lot to, and he and I have this conversation all the time. Would we be better off if we just read and read and read and read and read at whatever level a student can engage? Because the more time you spend reading, the better off you are. Our wager in social science is that that's not enough, particularly for younger students. You have to make it interesting. You know, the motivation piece is huge. The clarity and comprehension piece is huge. You have to monitor understanding. And we have content goals that we really care about. We want you to know how politics works in the pre-modern world, so we compare it to the modern world and say, we believe in equality, but we also have hierarchy. What's that about? Like, that's a conversation we feel we must have with kids. So, but as teachers, it's got to always be in the back of our mind that, is my lesson actually better than if we just read? And if we just read and answer the question, I mean, the challenge should be answer the question for the kid who needs to read the most. And so that's a real challenge. I wish I had something more definitive to say about it, except that we are well aware that this is a challenge in our field.
Can you clarify when you say, like, you know, what, you know, you wonder, would it be better if we just read and read and read?
Right.
You don't mean like having them read independently, do you? Or because a lot of them might not benefit from, or do you mean independently, or do you mean like a scaffolded kind of reading?
I mean two things. So and I'm open to feedback. Well, a technique I use increasingly in the 9th grade class, I've been doing this for years, but I do it more and more. I read aloud. Students still like it. In fact, students who can read very well will often say to me, keep going, keep going. But so almost always, especially if it's a narrative reading, if it's an argument, I may read the whole thing, or I may just make the argument. But we do a lot of narrative reading. I will often start the story and I'll say, okay, here's where we are, continue. And even reluctant readers will continue at that point. Sometimes I'll pull a student out and we'll just read. I'll read, they'll read, I'll read, they'll read, monitor comprehension, do all that stuff. So that could be a form of just reading all the time. Like for me, that would be a reading lesson still. Of course, if I just hand you the text and it's too hard for you, I've just wasted a block of your time because you're not really going to read it, or you're not going to really understand it. But the other thing I can say is, you know, what if we gave students readings that this is below their reading level? But you know what? Sometimes when I know nothing about a topic, I read something from middle schoolers. I'm old enough to be beyond shame about that. I want to see how the story is told in the simplest possible way. I mean, for some of my students, I think, wouldn't it be better if you don't pretend? This is for 5th graders. Just read it. Let's talk about it. Now read the one for 8th grade. Good. That's great. Now read the one for 11th grade. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, whatever way you get in, it's all good, right? So
yeah.
The document thing is different. So the reading that is the core of what we do is overwhelmingly not primary sources. Primary sources are hard. They're written by people who didn't care at all about us. There are no little text boxes on the side. They didn't include their own glossaries. They didn't have the courtesy to know any of our idioms and use them, except for Shakespeare, who's full of cliches. They're very foreign to us, right? And that's the whole point. So that's a curated experience in our world. And part of why I wanted the document initiative in the department, and we're working on it. Teams are making core lists of documents in each field, and we're developing models and protocols for how we're going to teach those documents. So having a document list means nothing. Having the document you want and the purpose for the document and a technique for making sure the kids know how to read it, that's the payoff, right? So that I can say, I have this little game I play. I go out at lunchtime and I find, when I'm on CAF duty at the high school, I'll go find a 10th grader. I say, hey, have you read Karl Marx? And sometimes I say yes, sometimes I say no. And if they say yes, they're all supposed to. If they say yes, I ask them. I said, so, tell me about Marx. What's his argument? And sometimes they know and sometimes they don't. What I want is for every kid to be able to have a discussion with me about core text. It doesn't have to be Marx. Some kid is out there, hey, that's the Marxist. No, I'm not shilling for Marx. I'm asking you. Anyhow, the goal was for kids to actually understand the text. One of the things I noticed, because the documents are hard, they take a long time to read. That's one of the reasons we don't read that many of them. And I've done this myself, and I see this still. Teachers will often move too quickly through the part where you simply have to understand what the text says. So in part I wanted the document initiative for my department for two reasons. One is so that we have a core experience. You've met Marx in 10th grade. And you can talk about Marx, because, by the way, this is a theory of revolution. It spawned, you can't understand the Cold War without it, right? You can't understand the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution. You can't think about the Enlightenment without knowing that Marx is translating it into economic terms. It's such a foundational text for understanding our world. Okay, so I want to have coherence in our curriculum sufficient to say all kids have met these 6 powerful thinkers, 12 powerful thinkers in 10th grade. But at a more prosaic level, I want all students to have the experience of deep reading. And the way to do that is to come to consensus about those texts and then to come to consensus about what experience with the text they'll have. So again, sometimes when the text is really hard, we fake it. Students fake it all the time, but we teachers can fake it too when we say, oh yeah, they did Marx. I give them a few pages, they read it, we talked about it. That is not the experience of reading Marx. It's so hard that you actually literally have to go paragraph by paragraph and either paraphrase or summarize. You can have all kinds of supports like glossaries, like text-dependent questions that draw your attention directly to that phrase, exactly to that vocabulary. But you have to go so slow to actually know that you've read it. And I want kids to have the repeated experience of having done that. We call it close read. It's close reading, right? But really, really do it. Really, really figure out what Marx is saying. And then you're not done still. You spent a long time trying to figure out what those 3 paragraphs from the manifesto said. Now you got to figure out, why did he say that? Because it's still a history class. And what we want to know is, who is this guy? He's talking to very few people. By the way, the manifesto wasn't even published in English for a long time, even though he's living in London when it was written. Why does he talk like that? The proletariat is going to radically transform the world. There are 40 people at a cafe talking about this. Those 40 people are going to transform the world? Why is he saying this? I want the person to be real, because one of our missions is, yeah, this guy's a dreamer. He's crazy. And he's Karl Marx, by the way. Good luck to you if you have such ambitions, right? You need to understand what the historical figures are doing, and you can't do that better than listening to them carefully and asking yourself, what were they thinking? Miriam knows that's question 2.
Yes, that's question 2. Yes, the 4-question method. They're great, very simple questions, and yet they're questions that hard to answer. Exactly. Yes. What were they thinking? So, okay, so to get there, to be at the high school level and able to do that, with support. Obviously, we have the foundational skills, which, the decoding, and that has to happen in the elementary school. The students have to come to you being able to decode and get the words off the page. And if they're not, like you said, it's a challenge. background knowledge, so there have been concerns. So we're kind of shifting to the K through 8, but K through 5 especially. All of this background knowledge vocabulary, it accrues over time, right? It's all cumulative. You're not going to be able to backfill everything in high school that if they didn't have it sort of develop to a certain extent throughout their whole education, right? Up to that point. So there have been concerns that there's very little time in like K through 5 for, well, both for social studies and for science, actually. But we're talking about social studies now. There was a parent who did a whole study about it a couple of years ago, or a few years ago before the pandemic, and saw that it had been reduced even so to the point where you look at the pie chart and you see like literacy and math are taking over the entire day pretty much, with especially literacy in K through 5 was like 50 something percent, and you've got like 5% of the time allotted for social studies. So what is going on with that diminished time? First of all, people attribute it to different things. They say, well, standardized testing focuses on reading and math, and so that's where the time, but that's a little bit, we know, misguided, because in order to read, to understand what you read, you need that background knowledge, like you were saying. So is it the standardized testing? Is it something else? And we also wonder what exactly is happening in the literacy block. I mean, you can't speak to that in the elementary school, but that is a question that we have. There's a lot of kind of generic reading skills that are being maybe practiced independently, like finding the main idea and making inferences, but it's not connected to like a cumulative kind of coherent building of knowledge. And there's been more attention in the science, kind of quote unquote science of reading conversations that are happening about that. So beyond foundational skills, how does that knowledge get built that is so crucial to vocabulary development that transfers, across disciplines? So what do you think is going on with that lack of time? First of all, as far as, and I know you can't, you're at the high school, not in the elementary school, but still just speculate about the lack of time and what kind of K through 8 teachers need in order to do that, as far as or you've spoken to your colleagues about it. And also, okay, sorry. So second part of that question involves kind of integration of English language arts and social studies. What do you know about how that can be more integrated? Because there's a lot of talk about integrating it, but you can't just say, okay, we'll go and integrate it. It seems like a much more complex thing. And there are curricula out there that are sort of, billed as English language arts curricula, but that actually do build a lot of social studies, have a lot of social studies content, like the core knowledge curriculum is one. There's one called Wit and Wisdom. So that's a multi-part question, but what do you think about time in elementary school on social studies, and what do you think about integration of English language arts, literacy, and social studies?
So I think there should be more time on social studies, as I said, and science. I'm new to the science of reading literature, but one of my favorites is Dan Willingham. I printed out one of the articles. I read his book on reading. I read his Why Students Don't Like School and so on. And he's smart and funny. I love that. And he says, reading comprehension strategies work. This is to your question, what's happening in literacy block and what could be happening with that time? So he says literacy strategies do work, and they don't take that long to learn. And you don't need to do them over and over again. They're not skills like a backhand in tennis, or they're not content-based skills. To be able to read a physics article, you need to know physics. And if it's on a magnetism problem, you need to know about magnetism, right? And if you're reading the history of Julius Caesar, you need to know about Julius Caesar. And so you need to spend a lot of time acquiring that knowledge. Just like if you want to talk about Marx, you actually have to spend a lot of time reading the text before you talk about what Marx was thinking. So yes, there are reading comprehension strategies. No, they don't take 90 minutes a day. So something else needs to be happening in those 90 minutes a day. And it should be, I think, content knowledge. Kids should be learning things. They should be hearing stories about in my field, they should be hearing stories about the past. They should be meeting characters from the past. And they should be talking about what were those people doing? Why did they do it? Why did the story go like that? How could it have gone a different way? They should be engaging in a way that's fun and interesting. So why is it like that? I think two reasons. And by the way, most of my knowledge comes not from Brookline. My kids went through those schools and I have no idea what they learned there, but they came out and they're fine. So, but I'm also very lucky. And I know that my wife taught them phonics. Schools, so we consult a lot for urban schools and charters in particular. There, it's all about testing. The reason social studies gets driven out in early grades in urban schools, as far as I can tell, is because they need to do test prep. But that's an insufficient explanation, because it turns out that arguably you'd be just as well off either having an integrated literacy history curriculum, literacy science, or just do your strategies for 15 minutes a week, but then load them up with knowledge and see how that works. Saturate them with the music of language in various fields. Tell them a lot of stories and get them to learn them and have them tell them back and so on. I think the reason that hasn't happened is the same reason, I've been in education for a very long time. And in the last 3 years, I've learned more about literacy than I knew in the 30 years before that. And, I'm very proud of the fact that Emily Hanford is a Brookline High alumna. I learned a lot from her. I learned a lot from Natalie Wexler, who is now an advisor to our 4QM project. Learned a ton from Dan Willingham. I read Stanislaw Dehaene's book on reading maybe 8 years ago or 9 years ago, and I didn't put together what it meant until I started to hear all this other stuff. And I think that bespeaks a crisis. Crisis may be too strong. I told you at the beginning that our textbooks are lousy and that our support materials aren't very good. That is true in education. The more I learn, the more I'm amazed at how little collectively we are bearers of wisdom about the brain, about how people learn, about how memory works. I've learned from my psychology teachers more stuff than people learn in grad school and education. Now, I will say that I never went to graduate school in education. I have an academic background. But I've hired lots of people who went to graduate school in education. This is not the stuff people are learning. They're not learning what it takes to read well, as far as I can tell. Certainly not high school teachers. Maybe in elementary education, the situation is better. But the state of knowledge in our field, if knowledge matters for reading, it also matters for teaching and running schools. And I think we just don't have enough of it. So we teach the main idea. It seems like a good idea, right? Turns out not to make any sense. We teach, look at the picture and guess at the word. Seems to make sense. It looks like it works, but we don't know, I think we don't know enough. And so people say there's a test and I have to prepare for the test. How can doing social studies possibly help with that? That doesn't make sense. And so they do something else.
So I know that Ola has some questions, so I want to let her jump in. But let me just to quickly piggyback off of that. So what do elementary school teachers need in order to teach social studies? Do they need a curriculum?
Yes.
Do they need something more than the curriculum materials that they are kind of using
Probably.
now?
So the answer to the first question is definitely yes. So I want to give a shout out to Greg Porter, who's the K-8 director of social studies in the district. He's in his second year. I think he's terrific. And what he did when he came in is he went to the early grade teachers and he said, let me see what you're doing. And I showed him what they have for curriculum. And he looked at it and he said, would you like help with this? Would you like me to actually get you curriculum? And they said uniformly, yeah, please. And so he devised a very thoughtful pilot where he got 3 versions of 3 products out on the market, and teachers tried these things out. He did it in K2 and I think in grade 5. I don't remember the details, but he's rolling it out in a deliberate way. And they tried different versions of curriculum and they got back together and they talked about it. And the pilot team said, you know what, this was the best, get us this one. And he's doing it. And he's rolling it out systematically. So teachers want it. They need it. They're generalists. They have a lot to do, limited time in a day. Curriculum gives you a place to start. You can make it better. You can learn more and amplify it and all that stuff. But the reality is you got to start somewhere. And wouldn't it be nice to have somebody who knows the field really well design that curriculum for you? Teachers are open to it and want it. So yes, teachers should have curriculum. I would say all the way through, but that's more controversial. But certainly in the early grades. The second thing is, how good is that curriculum? And to the point about integration, how literacy informed is it? So one of the things that we did with, my partner and I are writing elementary curriculum now. We've done some pilot units with a charter school in Nashville with some good early success. Teachers like it, kids like it. And we work from core knowledge texts. The Core Knowledge Foundation has history and geography texts. And we use those and we amplify them. There is a business called Amplify that does it for literacy, but we are enhancing those readers so that there's more to do, so the kids can be more engaged. But we think that's good. And when we do that, we're now acutely aware of the literacy impact. So we use techniques from the writing revolution, which the original concept was from Judith Hochman, who ran a very famous school for kids with language-based learning disabilities in New York. I have a friend who's 2 of his kids went there, and one of them is an engineering major at Michigan and couldn't read for many years. It works, So we incorporate a lot of those techniques because this is in elementary school. How could you miss the opportunity to practice the kind of writing that will make your reading better? And that's what Hochman and Wexler have tried to show, that, if you teach, reading is full of complex language. If you teach kids how to construct complex sentences, they will read them better, and then they'll understand complex text better. And so is the curriculum that Brookline will have going to be better than nothing? Absolutely. Is it going to be literacy informed? I don't know. I mean, what's out there so far, I don't know enough to say that it's going to do as much as it could to help kids become stronger readers.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Ola, do you want to jump in?
Sure, yeah. Thank you so much. So I had a question. You mentioned that sort of students who don't have access to text are more of a norm in your classes rather than sort of like outliers. And I wonder, well, first of all, like, does it tend to be students who have difficulties just accessing in terms of decoding issues? Is it students who have comprehension issues? Is it the critical thinking skills? Like, what is, and I'm guessing it's all of the above. And how are these students being differentiated in your classrooms? And how does, like, in terms of capacity, like, are you able to accommodate sort of both the students who, you mentioned prolifically read and pull books off the shelves, and the students who struggle, whether it's because of decoding skills, whether it's because of comprehension? So how are those accommodated across the different needs that they have in your classrooms?
So it's the norm that students are very different in our classrooms. I would not say it's the norm that, certainly it's not the case in our unlevel 9th grade class. It's not the case that most students struggle. On the contrary, so Brookline is a complicated district in this way. It's an incredibly highly educated population. Many, many, many people have fancy jobs and fancy degrees and lots of books at home, but not everyone. It's not there's no normal distribution in town. It's much more complicated than that. And I will say, I've had students say to me, so a kid, Mikey, love that kid. Kid once said to me, I think he was in Metco. And Mikey said to me, this is a tough town. I'm sitting in math class and all these kids have done Russian math. Mikey didn't do Russian math. That's more what Brookline is like. And so, and it's not just, kids who live in housing are much more likely to be at risk for low literacy levels, but there are all kinds of kids with language-based learning disabilities. It's more than that. But that's one thing, right? I mean, it's a very affluent community where not everyone's affluent, right? And that has correlation with vocabulary size and reading skills and so on. So it's complicated. What scaffold supports do we use? I mentioned leveled readings. You can all read about China, but mild, medium, and spicy. We have read aloud, we record. And again, the virtue of teamwork is in our 9th grade course. You can click on a link and they'll read to you. Many of our databases, you click and it'll read to you. You can read along. So that's a scaffold and support. We provide glossaries. We have graphic organizers, lots of graphic organizers. The school itself has learning centers for kids with documented learning disabilities. We have tutorial for any kid who needs it. And some of the work they do there is use of graphic organizers, structured reading and writing assignments, and so on. So lots of things. As I said, Sometimes I'll ask a student to sit in the hallway and we'll read together, back and forth. I mean, so we do lots of interventions like that. But it's more, there's no, I would say the norm is probably that students are grade level readers in most cases, but not in all cases. And that's the teaching challenge. And by the way, even the good readers, they're not as good as they're going to be, right? And if they don't keep reading, they're not going to be much, much better. The kid who's pulling books off the shelf will be. If I left him alone entirely, he'd be fine. In fact, he might be better off if I sent him to the library and said, you go read and come back to class at the end and tell me what you read. But that's also unusual. Most students still, instruction would help them.
Yeah. Ola, do you have any other question or anything in the chat?
I didn't see anything in the chat. I guess another question I have is like, how systematic is it? Like the things you describe, both in terms of differentiating and responding to student individual needs, as well as sort of like working on enrichment activities with students. Like, is that systematic across all teachers? Is there like, you know, how top down the curriculum is in the high school? Is it
It's
just
not. Yeah, it's not. So I would say, so part of it, so I mentioned the document initiative, you know, I want to identify our core documents and how we're going to teach them. There are many, in all the departments, there are many wonderful teachers who work really hard to meet kids' needs. And we take IEPs very seriously. And we all, you know, we all use graphic organizers and we all have access to the read aloud technology and all that stuff. Systematic and Brookline High School aren't words you often hear in the same sentence. Let's put it that way. There's a great deal of teacher autonomy and there's a great deal of, you know, people do a lot of things. Some of them are wonderful and some of them are okay. And some of them probably don't work, but we tolerate a wide latitude in both in curriculum choices and in pedagogical technique. You know, in the past, we have relied heavily at the high school on recruitment. I've had in the past the luxury of hiring excellent teachers from elsewhere and bringing them to Brookline High School. I have coached charter schools. We've all done this. You know, people have learned enormous skills in a charter environment. They come and they work for us and they bring the skills. They've worked in other school districts and they come here and they work for us. And that's tremendous. And typically what we do is we let them make a lot of choices once they get here. The 9th grade course in our department, it had many purposes, but one of them was also for faculty to practice working together. We're all assigned the exact same paper and our students are running it right now. I mean, this may now sound shocking, and in the clients we work with, this is not at all unusual. For us, this is earth-shattering. Like, we do this all the time. We've done interpretive papers, we're doing an explanatory paper, like we have almost like a system. It's amazing. We have it to some extent, like AP US History has a system and so on. Literacy, we don't have a system for literacy. I would say the document thing is that's not true. We've worked on literacy in other contexts, but I would say right now, the most significant collective effort we're making to make our reading practices similar is the document initiative. I mean, so,
Sorry.
no, I was just, so I go back and forth on this because, you know, I don't know who would write it. But if we had a great curriculum, I think it would be better for everyone if we just used it. If we had a US history curriculum that I really admired, I would go to the district and say, buy this for us and we're going to use it. And I would be willing to make people mad at me to implement that if I believed it was a great curriculum. I would do the same for any of our courses. And I think it's not because our teachers can't write curriculum, but it's two things. I think that people who write, I've come to believe more and more, and in part this is trying to do it myself and seeing how eager elementary school teachers are frequently to have curriculum and to have well-produced curriculum available to them. If we had it, it would be a baseline. It would guarantee a minimum, and it would be aligned with all the readings we need. I want to teach this, but I can't really find the reading to support it. Like, that would end. assessments, the alignment of assessment to curriculum. That would be so much better if professionals wrote the curriculum. And then you had the baseline instead of, I mean, teachers are very creative. I was very creative in the early part of my career. I made stuff up all the time, and some of it worked and some of it didn't. But what if professionals did that and gave me that, and the alignment was tight, and students would know what they were learning, and I would know what they were learning, and like everything worked that way, like a professional curriculum should. I think that would be better for everyone.
So what are some barriers? Because I mean, as a researcher, I was actually shocked to discover that there is no uniform curriculum across the board, both in elementary school as well as in high school and the middle school. What are the barriers for implementing a uniform evidence-based curriculum, not just literacy, but also in social studies and history, etc.?
The absence of evidence-based curriculum is the obstacle. So I've seen curriculum materials. I've seen lots of them. So I want to give a shout out to a guy I'm not having dinner with. He's out with my partner now. A guy named Art Worrell hired us to work at the Uncommon schools, Uncommon charter schools, 53 schools. And Art's the head of social studies for the high school, and Becky Gomez, head of social studies for the middle school. And Art saw us at a conference or read a paper or something and said, we have a common curriculum and charter, right? They march in lockstep. They created it themselves. They have a team of curriculum writers. They said, it's okay, it's good, it's not great. It sounds like you could help us make it more interesting and engaging. Like, okay. So we ended up working with them for 2 years with their team writing curriculum. And it was better. I think it was better when we left. Art thinks it was better when we left. Becky, who was the head of the middle school, those teachers were more gung-ho. They were more interested in having the curriculum, less resistant to changing practice, less resistant to adopting the whole thing. And they did it. And I think they did a really good job. That was hard. And that's in a charter environment. And by the way, I think it was better. I'm a guy who taught myself, and I work with another guy who taught himself, and we argued ourselves to a framework. And we looked around like nobody else even has a framework, really. So science-based, evidence-based, I don't really know. Practitioners in the field say it's better when we do this. People in Nashville say it's better when we take core knowledge and actually build lessons around it and build assessments tied to the lessons. But it's just not there. It's just not out there. And I got to say, I'm not going to mention the name, but one of the products that Greg bought for the elementary schools, I looked at it. It was terrible. It was ridiculous. It was a waste of children's time. And so I think we just have a long way to go.
So we have a question. Thank you. We have a question in the chat. So I'll just read it out. So thinking about the 14-year-old who recommended books to you, in my experience with my kids in K-8 ELA class, students are encouraged to read every night a book of their choosing. I believe that the primary goal is to develop a habit of reading regularly, but then in Brookline High School, my sense that the encouragement requirement to read regularly a book of one's own choosing outside the standard curriculum is no longer supported explicitly. So do you think explicitly encouraging that kind of reading regularly a book of one's own choosing at the high school level might help students, and maybe doing that outside of ELA, so in science, social studies, and etc.?
We used to do a drop everything and read day, an intercession day where we just read all day long. That was awesome. But that's just a day. That doesn't really address this concern. I also remember when my older daughter was a real rule follower, would come home from school and she'd plop herself down and start reading. I said, what are you doing? She said, oh, I was told to read for half an hour. She read anyway, by the way, but she was doing her homework. Unfortunately, there's a well-documented phenomenon. Students who read will read through middle school, and then they'll get to high school and they will stop reading for pleasure, or their amount of pleasure reading diminishes dramatically. Not for all kids, but for many kids. Not just us, it's in lots of places. And, you know, I can't but imagine that cell phones make that worse. But the reality is that high school is hard, and kids have a lot of homework, and they're not in 5th grade. When you tell a 5th grader, I want you to read for half an hour, they do it. Some of them, girls do anyway. But so in high school, if I say to my students, read for half an hour, and if I don't have an assessment on that reading, students write a little note in their planner. First of all, they pretend to move their hand in the planner, and then they write, not really. They're going to do the math homework first. They always do the math homework first. They always do English last. I mean, they've all told me this. They tell us all what they do. And if it says read for pleasure for 30 minutes, if they get to it, but then they have a phone. and they're old enough to make independent choices. So yes, before vacation, I told my students, and it was worth nothing, by the way, but I enjoy saying it, it's a vacation. Read something and come back and tell me about it. And of course, most didn't, but some did. And I got a new book recommendation at the end of it. It's a bigger problem. By the way, and I just want to say this here while we're together, we should ban cell phones in the high school. Sharon High School has no cell coverage in the high school. No cell phones work in that building. Kids would have more time to read in the building if we had no phones. That editorial is now over.
Thank you. I just want to, as a parent of two, children at the high school, or I don't know if children is the right word, but anyway, thank you for saying that. I agree.
It's really nice work by Marianne Wolf. She talks a lot about deep reading. I don't know if you got a chance to.
Yes, I read one of her books. No, I didn't read the Squid book. I read a different one. But yes, she's an advocate for losing yourself in the book.
Yep.
I love it myself.
We have a question from Peggy. She says, could you address one, the loss of curiosity from 4-year-olds to high schoolers, as well as the inability to focus, which kind of relates to that deep reading idea, and 2, experiential learning and how that gets lost, except science and art.
Experiential, hold on, I'm pulling up the chat. So I don't know. We could conjecture about curiosity. I mean, well, let me say a brain sciencey thing about that. What I've read about the curiosity thing, we do prune. Our brains get pruned, and a lot of the kids ask the craziest questions. Why do people die? Can I have dessert? I mean, there's a kind of serial curiosity in young kids, which is very bracing and very charming. Oh, I remember Ken Livingstone. I think Ken Robinson. Ken Robinson is a YouTube sensation, a British guy who is an advocate of creativity and learning. But a lot of what he says, we should just go back to when the brain was exploding with ideas. A lot of it is wildly implausible because our brains don't work the same way at age 4 and at age 14 and at age 40. They work differently. And we do focus and we do prune. And questions that used to seem very urgent are completely ridiculous to us now. Sometimes that's really good because some of those questions really were ridiculous. But there has to be joy and creativity at every stage of life. It just has to be age appropriate, seems to me. I get really excited reading books about reading now. It's a new hobby, right? So, and that probably wouldn't have worked when I was 4. So some of what's happening is what happens to humans in their brains as they get older, I think. I mean, without firm evidence, I have to say, but with lots of observation of the teaching profession and how it's changed over time, digital technology matters. And I don't think what I've read about is it doesn't rewire the brain, but it hogs all of our attention. And that sustained lack of attention does have effects on your ability to sustain attention. I mean, this is the wolf thing, right? And I think that's a real problem. My older daughter, who didn't get her first screen till later, reads more than the younger daughter who got the screen. And again, that's not science, that's anecdote. But I think we've all seen how much attention the phone takes. The average American apparently during daylight hours checks their phone every 4 minutes. That's a pretty staggering statistic. It's an average. Eric doesn't do that. Experiential learning, it depends what you mean. So our 4QM method is meant, among other things, it's a war on fakery and a war in favor of curiosity. We think if you ask real questions, class is much more interesting. If you ask fake questions, kids know when it feels like school. So my partner loved school. He wanted to be a teacher in 8th grade. I hated school. And mostly particularly the adolescent part, for mostly adolescent reasons. But for me, every day that is not about something that inspires curiosity, I'm just not interested myself. So I don't think it's the experiential part that matters. The idea of authenticity education strikes me as odd. We want kids to have white-collar jobs when they're 14 and 15. God forbid. I mean, school is actually more interesting than that, which is why I avoided having a job all these years. One of those jobs, one of those adult jobs. But what we can do is ask them real questions about real people doing real things. And that's in history. I mean, we got millions of those. What happened is a really interesting question if you set it up right. Things used to be one way and then they got to be a different way. What happened? How did that happen? Americans weren't Americans. They were British, and they were very happy to beat the French and their Indian allies. And 20 years later, they're shooting British people and they're saying we're Americans. What happened? I mean, that's a story you have to learn in school, but it can be interesting if you set it up right. And the people you meet the story can be really interesting if you set them up right and get to know them, and so on and so forth. You can find comparative puzzles all over the place. You can argue about what the right thing to do is. All of these things are really good. Their classroom, it does involve reading and writing and talking and classroom activities. But honestly, it's school. I mean, there are constraints. I can't take kids on backpacking trips all the time. I would love to. Not sure what they learn, but I would have a great time with them. It would be very experiential. You do some science. But even in the constraint of the egg crate school, we can do a lot, and we can do a lot more if we build around genuinely interesting puzzles and teach kids how to help kids learn how to solve them. I love field trips, by the way. Don't get me wrong. I love simulations. Love all that stuff. Love taking kids on trips.
Yeah, and I will, can I just chime in for one second before see if there's any other more questions? But I mean, I think the curiosity, the question about curiosity. Well, yes, I agree that those questions, those 4 questions in the discipline are questions that can really foster curiosity. I mean, that, what happened? I mean, kids love stories. That's a story, right? Story first. But what were they thinking? I mean, all of those questions are really at heart very curious questions. Like they kind of embody curiosity, but also like you need knowledge to be curious about something, right? Like you can't, I mean, I'm not curious about something that I know nothing about. I can't be really, I need a little bit of priming, a little bit of knowledge in order to develop that curiosity. So I think our kids do too. So, and I think that, from what I hear of the more kind of classrooms in the elementary, just to bring it back to the early grades, the elementary grades that do have a much more sort of knowledge focused, for example, social studies and science, of course, it's just so much more fun for kids. Like, like, what did you learn today? Oh, I learned to make an inference. No, I learned about something. I learned about something that happened. I learned about something in the natural world. So I just think it's so much more engaging for kids to learn meaty stuff and makes them more curious. I don't know. That's just.
Miriam, I think this is part and answer to your question. Why did we get the idea that teaching literacy strategies for 90 minutes a day is a good idea? Because the test was an excuse to do it, but the fallacy had to do with exactly what you're saying. It was about knowledge generally. That somehow that's prosaic. It's it's Mr. Gradgrind. It's Dickens, right? We're just going to jam facts in the kid's head. Facts. That's not what it's about. Exactly what you said is what it's about. You can't be curious about things you don't know about. My daughter, the older one, the one who read because she was told to, knew the name of every Pokemon in the Pokemon universe when she was 5. Every single one of them, and she could tell you a story about them. I had very advanced ideas on gender. I bought her a train set, and she took all the train cars and she made little stories out of them, and she knew the world she created. Dinosaurs. I know kids who know everything about there is to know about dinosaurs, about geology. Kids want to learn things. It's not a chore for them. And if you notice what they do with it, it's almost always a story. T-Rex eats somebody. He chases them down and he eats them, right? That's great. That's an awesome story. So I have a friend who lives in a very progressive town like Brookline in New Jersey, and his kid was very precocious. And he said he goes to school and he just doesn't seem to be learning anything. He says, why don't they tell him stories all day long? Mythology, do all the world's mythology, just do all of it. And he will, if you tell him to memorize it, he'll memorize it. And if you tell him to tell me about the, Thor and Zeus, and he'll do it. Why not make him do that? This is the age when they are sponge-like. If you put it in a story form, they'll learn anything. And if you have that, by the way, you're acquiring so much vocabulary about human motivation. Arcane vocabulary. Olivia, I'm sure, does not remember the name of all those Pokemon or what the special powers were, but she's learned so much about situation and about the world and about how to describe things and how to argue about things. it's just such a language-rich activity to just load kids up on stories. And science and social studies could both be that. And wouldn't that be better than 90 minutes of worksheets on the main idea?
Well, that's a good place to end. Although I want to make sure if anyone has more questions, but that is a yes. We're hearing yes in the chat. Amen.
I just want to quickly do a little quick disclaimer because we are a literacy group. So we're not saying that explicit systematic instruction in literacy is not important, but it can be well integrated into content area and social studies. So you could do literacy and gain vocabulary and content knowledge and all of that if done correctly. And there are like good interventions and curricula around those domains. So we're not advocating for eliminating literacy blocks, but integrating literacy blocks with social studies and science in a way that works well. So
Totally. And by the way, the people who make fun of phonics because that's stupid and boring, have you really forgotten what it's like to be a kid? You can't make that a game? I can make that a game. Come on.
It's also very magical and rewarding when a child learns how to actually read. just putting it out there, but I've seen it happen, and it's pretty cool. It's a pretty powerful feeling for them. So yeah,
transformative, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Thank you for inviting me to talk about things I barely know about, but stimulating.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and it's a just interesting conversation, gets us all thinking. I think we have a couple of kind of if you have a couple minutes, I know we're a little bit over, but a couple last minute questions, is that, or no? I saw some hands. No? Okay.
I think it was clapping.
Oh, clapping. Oh, okay. Sorry. I saw the hand. I don't know my emojis so well. Anyway, thank you so much, Gary. Really appreciate it. Yeah, we will, we'll follow up with some more links, and we'll share the recording, and feel free to reach out to us. Brookline Literacy at gmail.com, I think. Yep. And thank you so much for joining us. This was great.
Thank you, Gary. I also, before we go, thank you so much, Gary, for joining us. I want to do that like halfway. This was wonderful, and thanks for everyone for joining us. Also, we do have some events coming up that I just want to mention to everybody while we're here on April 2nd, Sunday. So there's a lot of literacy stuff happening in town. The end of March and the beginning of April. I think there's a big conference at BU Wheelock. And on Sunday, the Coolidge Corner Theater is going to be showing this film called The Right to Read. And we've helped them to put together a panel discussion after that, which will include Emily Hanford, Brookline graduate and amazing journalist. Will be moderated by a school committee member, Stephen Ehrenberg, and have some other really great people with a lot of knowledge on this. And then the activist and educator who's featured in the film, Kareem Weaver, we're going to have a conversation with him, a Brookline Literacy conversation with him on April 30th. So I hope you'll all join us for both of those. So the first one is April 2nd at 2 p.m. at the Coolidge Corner Theater. And then the event with Kareem Weaver is on Sunday, April 30th. Is that the right date? I think.
Yeah. April 30th on Zoom. Yep.
On Zoom, exactly.
Yep. At 7 p.m. Yeah.
So we're really looking forward to both of those events. So thank you again, Gary. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much.